everyone. Welcome to the Stick to Wrestling podcast. My name is John McAdam. It's the holiday season, so I don't have a song to mangle. Sean just did something very – Sean just became a very happy guy. Thank you for listening, and this is Stick to Wrestling. It's the only wicked good wrestling podcast out there. Give us 60 minutes, and we will give you a wicked good podcast. And with that, I want to bring on my convivial co-host, Mr. Sean Goodwin. Sean, instead of us going on and on about how convivial you are, could you tell the listeners about our Facebook page?
Absolutely, but one correction about what you said. I may be happy about it, but your little song deal has a following. So, I mean, I think there would be unhappy people.
You know what happened, really? I'm like, okay, we do a countdown, show's about to start. I'm like, oh, man, I don't have a song.
Oops. Facebook page. If you have not joined the Facebook page, this is what you missed this week. Who did Bob Backlund beat 40 years ago? Why is Billy Graham having a temper tantrum 37 years ago? Is Gypsy Joe the only man to wrestle Abraham Lincoln and Taz? If you were going to hold a wrestling card in Beesville, Texas, where would it be? How did Jerry Graham's reverse Buddy Rose diet work out? Did Ricky Dozan ever get into a fight with a 49er lineman? How's Tony Marino? All this and pictures and all other kinds of old school wrestling goodness. So you need to join.
I missed the Ricky Dozan thing. That's got to be against Nomalini, right?
Yep.
Okay, that's what I figured. All right, we are here. It's the final month of Stick to Wrestling for not only the year, but the decade as well. Get ready for that, kids. This is being released December 6, 2019. Would have been Nick Bockwinkel's 85th birthday. Nick Bockwinkel is an Inner Circle Hall of Famer, one of the greatest ever. And 33 years ago, Rick Rude and Manny Fernandez won the NWA Tag Team titles. I want to talk about a little bit about that. But before I do, I want to bring on our guest this week. He's always a popular favorite, Mr. Thomas Bane. Thomas, how are you?
Season's greetings, John. Happy to be back on the show again to talk about something that occurred several years before I was born, the 1979 PWI Awards.
There you go. Yeah, and that's going to be our main focus, but I want to talk a little bit about Rude and Fernandez winning the tag team titles. This was, literally a couple of weeks, if not like 10 days before I started getting the Wrestling Observer newsletter, which kind of changed my outlook on pro wrestling. But even as someone who was a magazine mark, as I was, when I saw that Rick Rude and Manny Fernandez, they started teaming regularly, and it was announced the week before, next week, Rock and Roll Express to defend the tag team titles against Rude and Fernandez, managed by Paul Jones, I figured it out right away that they were going to win the tag team titles. Why? Number one, I figured it was going to be a favor, a thank you note to Paul Jones, who got his head shaved at Starrcade. And number two, this is what we're doing with Paul Jones moving forward now that his feud with with Jimmy Valiant has finally come to an end after 4 long years. The thing is, I didn't really like this tag team very much. I know they're kind of remembered fondly, and I like them as individuals, both Rude and Fernandez, but I thought Rude, Fernandez, and Jones just never had any chemistry. Thomas, what are your thoughts on the Rude Fernandez team?
Well, I kind of vary a bit to what you said about Paul Jones. I always originally thought that Crockett gave the belts to Rude and Fernandez when you already had, the Road Warriors, the Midnights, Tully and Arn, the Rock and Rolls. I thought he did it to build 2 different stars in case somebody bolted for the WWF. He had somebody ready-made to be in that top program. Otherwise, I don't know why you wouldn't just play hot potato with those 4 tag teams right there. Giving it to Rude and Manny, he said, okay, now we have a plan B if C and D jump over to the WWF.
Yeah, that's true. And plus, Rude had just gotten there. Fernandez had just turned heel. I had heard that they had plans for Rick Rude as a singles, but this is their way of establishing him. Sean, any thoughts on the Rude Fernandez team?
I think they're remembered fondly because of that match. That was a great match.
I thought that
they won the titles from the Rock and Roll Express.
I hated that match.
How could you hate that match? I just saw it recently. I got pissed off again. I knew it was going to happen. I've seen the match before. It happened 20 years earlier, and I still got mad. That That's a sign of a great match.
Oh, okay. I mean, I got mad at Mr. Wrestling too for the stuff he was doing to Magnum TA years and years after I was first made aware of it. But yeah, I thought the match was just too slow moving. It was too long. I did not like it.
Meant something. I thought it was fantastic.
I thought it just dragged out. I'm sorry. It was the what's the name of that Vietnam movie that came out in '79 with De Niro?
The Deer Hunter.
It was the Deer Hunter of wrestling matches.
That ain't fair.
You'll never hear something like that, a comparison like that.
Compare it to the Midnight Express now. Make it more depressing.
Oh, geez. Anyway, yeah, the whole Rude Fernandez thing unraveled in a really ugly manner. First, Rick Rude left, so they announced that Paul Jones fired him or something, and that Fernandez and Koloff were now the tag team champions. But wait, a week later, Fernandez has also walked out. So they run an old tape of the Rock and Roll Express beating Rude and Fernandez, who were no longer the tag team champions, as per their announcement, for the titles. And everyone in the audience was wearing a coat, so you could tell it was an old match. It fell apart pretty badly. But anyway, as alluded to earlier, we are going to do part 1 of the 1979 Pro Wrestling Illustrated Awards. Basically, you all know that Pro Wrestling Illustrated came out with awards at the end of every year. They had a ballot. You could send in a ballot. I don't know what they did with the ballots, if they just went straight to the trash or if they opened them to laugh at them. But it was the staff of the Apter magazines that made the decision. So let's start with the most – and by the way, we are going to use Apter magazine standards for this. And what does that mean? Well, the Apter magazines, focused on United States and Canada wrestling, and number 2, they acted as if the sport was a shoot, which is, a good part to that. So basically, we're giving the Wrestler of the Year award to whoever got the best push. And with that, theirs was number 1, Harley Race. Number 2, Dusty Rhodes. Number 3, Jimmy Snuka. And number 4, Bob Backlund. Thomas Bane, first, your thoughts on their list.
I think that list is – I'm kind of surprised that Jimmy was so far up, considering the fact you only had held the Mid-Atlantic U.S. title and Mid-Atlantic tag titles with Orndorff and gave it up. Was never really in the world title picture. And I kind of wonder, because this is the first year that PWI did the awards. I think in Victory Sports it did it all the way up until from 72 to 78. And 79 was the first year that PWI had did it. But I can't remember a year where – go ahead, John.
No, I was going to say, you just made a really good point. PWI didn't start coming out until the summer of 1979, and I'm lying when I tell you that PWI did these awards. It was Sports Review Wrestling, who either the Wrestler or Sports Review Wrestling were doing the awards by this point. We're always doing the awards before then, but they're kind of now retroactively known as the PWI Awards. But you're right. This came out in Sports Review Wrestling.
And I'm trying to think back to where a guy who wasn't in the world title picture, either a long-term challenger or even champion, was in the first 3 runners up, let alone winner. So Jimmy being up here is kind of surprising in 79, but looking at it, I mean, I would have to go with Harley Race just by the fact that Backlund, if you're going on a total kayfabe standpoint, he lost the belt to Inoki in Japan. He had the belt held up against Bobby Duncombe. Harley kind of just ran roughshod in 79.
Oh, boy, Jimmy. You know what, though? Now here's another PWI rule. They never acknowledged that Bob Backlund lost the title in Japan. I think I've told this on the show before. I remember one of the non-Apter magazines came out with a story that Inoki won the belt, and I see pictures of his match against Bob Backlund. I see Inoki with the WWF Heavyweight Championship, and I'm just like, nah, no title change. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, I think Snuka is kind of weird in here. He doesn't really fit in. Yes, the United States Championship was really important. Yes, he was getting his first push, but I don't know. I think he's the odd man out here.
I don't mind Jimmy there. There are other guys you could put there. You could put Tommy Rich. He had a great year. There's really no clear-cut 4 guy. Ric Flair. It wasn't a huge Flair year, but Jimmy can't. I mean, this was really his first national exposure where he kind of became a big name, and he had a huge year. He was crazy over in JCP. So I don't really have a major problem with it. Harley's the winner. This is his last great year. I think even on Steve Yoe's list, they had him as the winner. So I have no problem there. It was a big year for Dusty, and a good year for Bob. This is really the one category I don't have a major problem with anything here.
All right, Thomas, give us what your listing would be for this. Your awards
for just Wrestler of the Year, or how do you want to do this?
For Wrestler of the Year,
I would go Harley 1, obviously. As I said, I would go Dusty 2, Bob 3, and at 4, I would go Flair, actually.
I mean, Flair had a huge year. I have Ric Flair at number 4. He had a huge year. He had established himself as the number 1 babyface in the Mid-Atlantic territory after he had been I think it's fair to say he'd been the lead heel since around 76. It's funny, when Flair turned, when I first read about it in the magazines, I could not believe it. I thought it was it's almost like this has to be wrong. Ric Flair is the most evil guy in the world. As time went on, the turn seemed more and more inevitable. Of course, they were going to turn him at some point. Sean, who are your top guys for the 1979 PWI Wrestler of the Year award?
I hate to admit it, but I pretty much agree with your list, John. I mean, maybe Tommy Rich at 4. Because that was his big breakout year. I mean, there's a couple. Wrestling 2 had a great year in '79, but I mean, there's no Pat Patterson had a great. Yeah, maybe Pat. But yeah, I would say Rick's fine at 4.
Okay.
Everyone else is good.
So you would have had Harley at 1.
Yep. Dusty at 2. Backlund 3.
All right.
And then say Ric Flair 4.
All right. I have Dusty Rhodes.
Here.
I'm sorry, Thomas. Go ahead.
Are we all in unison on this?
I'm sorry?
We all in unison? Yeah, just get used to it. But yeah, on this one we are.
Okay. Yeah, my top 5, I have Dusty Rhodes as number 1. It was a tough one between my top 3. I just figured that Dusty, he had a huge year anyway, but this was the year he finally broke through and won his first NWA title.
And you hate Harley.
What's that?
And you hate Harley.
I don't hate Harley.
You have a very firm anti-Harley. Your opinion on Harley is like my opinion on Backlund.
I do not hate Harley Race. I was a huge fan of Harley Race.
You have said many times on this show how much you got sick of Harley Race by the time you got right around to this point.
That is true. Probably not at this point. Probably by this point the next year. But by that time, I wanted a new NWA champion. But yeah, I mean, there's a big difference between me thinking 4+ years with the title is a little bit too much as opposed to me actively disliking the guy. I'm a big Harley Race fan.
Yeah, this is his last great year. I agree with you, though. The next year, he shouldn't be in consideration after that.
I would have liked to have seen a permanent new champion in 1980. But anyway, I have Rhodes number 1. Top 3 are very close. I had Harley Race number 2 because I hate him. And Bob Backlund number 3. He had his first full year as WWF champion. And he has, by the time 79 came and went, I felt like he had established himself as the WWF champion, not the new guy anymore, but the guy. Number 4, I had Ric Flair. Number 5, I had Pat Patterson because he helped make that happen for Bob Backlund. He had a huge year. I wanted to kind of shoehorn Nick Bockwinkel in here somewhere because he went on and just kept being Nick Bockwinkel, an all-time great, even with Bobby Heenan gone for most of the year. But I just couldn't shoehorn him in.
An additional thing on Pat is that he was also the tag team champion with the AWA that year.
That is an excellent point. I remember him debuting on WWF TV, managed by the Grand Wizard, saying, hey, what's going on here? He's the AWA tag team champions. But I kind of figured out that, well, that means he's losing those titles. So anyway, Next up, the Pro Wrestling Illustrated, or I guess I'd call them the Apter Mags Tag Team of the Year for 1979. This was, you know what? This was a tough one, although I think my number one is a clear number one when you stop and think about it. But there are a lot of great tag teams. Their awards, number one was Ivan Putski and Tito Santana. Number two, Jerry and Johnny Valiant. Number three, Paul Jones and Baron von Raschke. And number four, The Spoiler and Mark Lewin. Thomas, can you share your thoughts about their top four?
When I looked at their top four and I saw Putski and Tito and the Valiant brothers, the first thing I did was I scrolled down the rest of the list and I kind of nodded my head and realized the PWI was playing politics. They didn't want to have too many NWA guys versus too few WWF guys, sprinkling a few, here, a few there. That's the only reason I could see both the Valiants and Ivan and Tito on here. The Valiants were made to look like fools. It's going to be the second best tag team of the year when they were losing basically handicap matches to Andre the Giant in '79 is laughable to me.
And what you said is totally true. I mean, you could see it even when there was no wrestling war, that these awards were very political. For example, they gave World Class a little bit of a nod with The Spoiler and Mark Lewin. I just can't see them at number four. And then when the wrestling war broke out, I mean, look out. These awards were turned into like major political pawns with, always going out of their way to please Dusty Rhodes by giving him individual awards and the NWA awards over Mid-South and the WWF.
And our good ship agreement is about to hit a rock. Actually, the Spoiler and Lewin is the one team here I don't have a major problem with because they basically carried the heel side of Dallas for the entire year. So they were significant. This isn't even Paul Jones' best team this year. His team with Steamboat was better than this.
True, but and by the way, we're recording this on Wednesday the 4th. I found out that on December 3rd, 1978 is the day that Paul Jones turned on Ricky Steamboat. So they were no longer together in 79.
Okay, so I'm still not having them there, though.
Right.
Jerry and Johnny Valiant, no. I just figured there was a Putski bribe. Maybe Thomas is right. There was a whole politics thing. No, I sent you notes of this, and it was basically just a breakdown for each category, just so we looking at the same thing until we get to the tag team, when there's like 2 pages of me complaining. This is just off the top of my head, I'm thinking. Blonde Bombers, Wrecking Crew, Stevenson Patterson, Lawler Dundee, the Von Erichs, Ole and Ivan, hell, Rich and the Crusher, Graham and Kern, the Briscoes, Lane and St. John, Watson Robley, the Freebirds. I will put all of those guys ahead of the 4 there on that list.
Wow.
And as far as my team of the year, here's where we're going to disagree. Honestly, I'm like, you guys are going to bust my up about this, but I'm sitting there trying to talk myself out of it, and I can't.
They're my number one.
One is
Latham.
Just kidding. I
don't even know who you have. Go ahead.
Latham and Ferris, the Blonde Bombers.
Oh wow,
they were great. Great. I'll defend it. They were great. They were heat machines all year long. They could work heel matches. This isn't like the Moondog, Larry Latham. Okay, this is the guy who is a great Southern wrestling heel in the ring, and no one was more obnoxious than Wayne Ferris at this time. It was just the sum was greater than the parts. This was a fantastic year for them, in a down year for tag teams.
But here's the other part of it. I mean, we're talking, PWI. If pro wrestling was a shoot, I mean, Memphis compared to the WWF, Mid-Atlantic, Georgia, etc. I mean, they're a step down from those territories. So those guys are big fish in a small pond.
That may well be true, but they've given Memphis guys awards before.
They have. I just think there's a lot of competition here, but at least you're thinking for yourself independently, and that's what.
Oh, I will defend it. I absolutely think they dominated not only Memphis but all of Tennessee and some others, at least all of Tennessee, for pretty much the entire year.
Yeah, but that's like saying, Team X in Mid-Atlantic dominated Virginia, South Carolina, and North Carolina.
Right.
And North Georgia.
Exactly what Jones and Von Raschke did. And they didn't even do that.
I don't know. Well, that's where we're all about opinions here. Who's your number 2?
Let's see. 2, I would say Stevens and Patterson.
Okay, good choice.
I would say Lawler Dundee at 3, Ole and Ivan at 4.
All right. Here's what I had. Number 1, I had the Georgia tag team of Ivan Koloff and Ole Anderson. I had them because they were the tag team champions. They teamed regularly. They were the main event very often in a major promotion. That's why I went with them. They did the angle where the two of them beat up Dusty Rhodes in a parking lot with a lead pipe or something, and they made a lot of money from that angle, and it was Dusty with various tag team partners going up against Ole and Koloff, and then they had Tommy Rich and a bunch of guys going against Ole and Koloff. Once again, in the main event, going around the horn, including the City Auditorium and the Omni in Atlanta. Number 2, for similar reasons, Paul Jones and Baron von Raschke in the Mid-Atlantic territory. They were the NWA Tag Team Champions, and frequently they were in the main event in the main town against Flair and Mulligan more often than not, or Steamboat and Youngblood towards the end of the year. Number 3, I went with the Valiant Brothers. Even though they had, I thought their late 78, 79 run was a disappointment because they seemed like such a big deal when they were here in 74 and 75. I thought, and I think they thought they were going to get that part 2, but it never happened. Probably partially because Jimmy got sick.
I was going to say, point of contention, this is not that Valiant team.
That's a really good point. They brought in Johnny, who was not Johnny, Jerry.
Guy Mitchell.
Guy Mitchell, who was an excellent worker but did not have the charisma of Johnny or Jerry.
And the other two Valiants hated him.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that the three of them just didn't get along.
Yeah, Bo has said it here.
What's that?
Bo James has said it here.
Okay. Yeah. But at the same time, they were a big deal. They were not at Madison Square Garden, but they did get main events in like the smaller arenas. They had Johnny got main events against Bob Backlund. He got a big one at the Philadelphia Spectrum. Jimmy got some main events against Backlund. So they were a big deal. And let's face it, the WWF was a huge territory. So they dominated this tag team scene for most of the year, and I went with them. Number 4, Vern Gagne and Mad Dog Vachon. Very much an oddball tag team, won the AWA tag team title, something you'd never think Vern would do at this point in his career, but it would, they got a big push and came as a big surprise. Number 5 is my version of Ferris and Moon. What's his name? Wayne Ferris.
Larry Latham,
thank you. The Kiwi Sheep Herders out in Portland.
Yeah.
Big fish in a small pond, but they got a huge push. It pained me to leave out the tag teams of Jimmy Snuka and Paul Orndorff and Gino Hernandez and El Gran Marcus. So that's kind of me saying I don't think it was all Spoiler and Lewin down in Dallas.
Well, I mean, they were a big part. Again, I didn't put them in my top 4, but I'm saying if I'm going to defend one of the 4, that's it. I don't like any of them. I can think of 10 guys over any of those 4 that I just listed off. That was just off the top of my head from that year. It's a terrible list from them.
Yeah, it kind of is. What's that?
I was going to say my top 4. I don't know if we were going to go on 4, but my top 4 pretty much bounces around yours. But I had Stevens and Patterson at 4. I'll be very quick with this. I had Flair and Mulligan at 3. Paul Jones and the Baron at 2. And at number 1, I went a little bit off the reservation there, and I went with Snuka and Orndorff.
Snuka and Orndorff is absolutely defensible. They got a huge push at the beginning of 1979.
And by Von Erichs, I went with the Kevin, David, Fritz trio of them, so I didn't really sequester to 2 of the 3 or 2 of the 4 at that point in time. So.
You know what? They gave it to the Freebirds as a 3-man tag, so you're totally allowed to do that. I remember I was in New York, February 1979. I was at Grand Central Station ready to come home, and I picked up a copy of The Wrestler, where I learned that Paul Jones had turned on Ricky Steamboat, which just shocked me. I mean, it was probably the biggest wrestling storyline shock I'd ever experienced. And number 2, this guy I'd never heard of, Paul Orndorff, was part of the NWA Tag Team Champions with Jimmy Snuka, who I had no idea had come to the Carolinas. So 2 big surprises for me. But anyway, all right, match of the year. Now, this one's a little bit tough because it doesn't go by Wrestling Observer standards, which, by the way, I'd like to do a Wrestling Observer type show for 79, even though they didn't even have their awards by then. Theirs was the most significant match of the year, the biggest match, if you were. They gave it to August 21st, 1979. Dusty Rhodes beats Harley Race for the NWA title. They only had 1 match. They didn't give us 4. Thomas, what was your 1979 match of the year?
It's really hard to go against Dusty Harley, but if I'm going to have a contrarian opinion here, it would probably be Bob Backlund, Pat Patterson in the cage at MSG.
That's my number 2.
If you go on the Pro Wrestling Illustrated website and you go through their past, they actually do put 4 down for this category for this year.
They did?
Yeah, they did. They have Backlund Patterson, Backlund Bockwinkel from Toronto on March 25th, and Wrestling 2 and Ernie Ladd in the Superdome on July 21st for the North American title.
All right, thank you for that. I did not know. So I'm assuming the Backlund Patterson cage match was number 2.
Yes, they had Backlund Patterson at this was September 24th at MSG, and that was 2. And then Backlund Bockwinkel, which I've never seen. I've never seen the last 2, so I'm not sure.
Okay, Backlund Bockwinkel, to me, the bloom was off the rose, so to speak, when it came to unification matches. At the same time, it's still Backlund Bockwinkel. And 2 versus Ladd was I think that was the main event of the Superdome show, with 2 defending the North American title. I guess I can look that up after the show. But anyway, so Thomas, your number 1 was Backlund versus Patterson in the cage match. Did you have a number 2?
I would have flip flopped 1 and 2 as how PWI had it. Actually, I would go that route with Backlund Patterson 1 and then Race Rhodes number 2. 3. It's really hard for me to pinpoint a single match because they all kind of really blend together. But I would be really hard-pressed in 1979 to not include a Jerry Lawler Mid-South Coliseum match in there somewhere in that top 5. One of the blow-off programs that he had there, whether it was Latham and Ferris or whoever it was at that point in time. And Sean can probably go into much greater detail on that than me, so I'll hand it off to him.
Yeah, Sean, tell us what you think Memphis match of the year was for 79.
I believe there's a very good Bockwinkel Lawler match in there. You could do the Tupelo match, which, I mean, I know it kind of gets the reputation for what happened to the concession stand, but I mean, leading up, that made sense if you watch the whole rest of the match, which leads me back to how great Latham and Ferris were, is that they were so obnoxious that it was obvious that Dundee and Lawler's reaction would be just to completely flip out and destroy everything, because that made perfect sense. They were that annoying. So yeah, you could put that match. But if I have to go by the standard that you're saying, which is the standard we're looking at here, it's Race and Rhodes. NWA title switch automatically gets it always. And after that, you'd have to say Backlund Bockwinkel, because it was, you're talking about a unification. Yes, the Rose is off. I agree. It's still a unification.
And it's still Backlund Bockwinkel.
Yeah, it's still Backlund Bockwinkel. But if this is by Observer standards, this is Backlund Patterson all day.
Okay, yeah, and like I said, we'll do a show on that one. I actually have to think about that. I'm not sure if that one. It definitely was an excellent match. I don't know if I can come up with one better that I've actually seen. Here is my top 4. And you can tell it looks like I've got a little bit WWF bias here. Number one, finally, Dusty Rhodes wins the NWA title from Harley Race on August 21st, 1979. We've expressed on this show how much we hated the idea of Dusty losing the title with a broken arm by DQ 7 days later or whatever it was. I don't even think it was 7 days later. But in a vacuum, that is match of the year by PWI standards. Number two, as I stated, I have the Bob Backlund versus Pat Patterson cage match. It is the only time someone got 4 matches at Madison Square Garden against Bob Backlund. It was a great historic match. It ended a huge feud between Bob Backlund and Patterson, the Intercontinental Heavyweight Champion. Number 3, I went with the Bob Backlund versus Greg Valentine match, their first ever match from February 19th, 1979, which was released on WWE Network, I want to say like 6 months ago, and I thought it was just a fantastic match. We don't really take that into consideration for this, but it was the young, upcoming superstar Greg Valentine invading the WWF for the first time, having a major series against Bob Backlund. And, I thought it was a big deal, both now and at the time. Number 4, and I don't have the date in front of me. I think it was off the top of my head, July 24th, 1979. It was the Bob Backlund versus Pat Patterson, their first match, where it was just a few weeks after Pat Patterson won the Intercontinental title on television from Ted DiBiase by knocking him out after taking a pair of brass knuckles out of his trunks and KOing DiBiase. They used that finish to set up this match where Patterson used the brass knucks to not knock out Bob Backlund, but bloody him up and get the match started. And you should have seen the heat when Patterson went into his trunks to get that foreign object. I mean, Madison Square Garden went crazy, and when he went to go use it, it went crazy. So, again, Patterson, was a really big deal. He came in to wrestle Backlund. That's why I went with that one, number 4. Sean, any final thoughts from either you or Thomas?
Like I said, this was just by the category. It's an obvious one. It has to be the NWA title match because what is the most significant match? If there's an NWA title switch, that's it back then. I mean, everything else is secondary.
All right, Thomas, any parting thoughts on? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, when we talk about like these interpromotional matches like Backlund and Bockwinkel, to me, I think almost every single interpromotional match has been a disappointment with the exception of Harley Race, Billy Graham. So I can't really just go ahead and put that in the top 3, top 5 on reputation alone because the ones we have seen have been complete stinkers.
Oh, I'm not saying on reputation at all. I'm just saying on the significance of it. If we're going by Pro Wrestling Illustrated standards, it's a significant match. I agree with you. Only one's been anywhere near decent.
Yeah. I mean, the Race Backlund match from Madison Square Garden from 1980 was absolutely awful. And I have not seen the Omni match from July 4th, 1982 with Flair versus Backlund. I don't think anyone who wasn't at the arena has seen it, but that match had the reputation also of being absolutely awful.
And even the Race and Superstar match was in a downpour at the Orange Bowl.
Yeah. I mean, supposedly they did the best they could with what they had, but I mean, you've got superstar Billy Graham in a soaked ring, so I mean, that's not anyone's fault. It's just, hey, that's what happens in Miami. All right. Feud of the year. This did not exist in the Apter Mag Awards for 1979, yet I have my list anyway, but Thomas is the guest, and Thomas, I would like to start with you. 1979 Feud of the Year, in your opinion.
It's hard to go, to the safe answer and go with Backlund, Patterson, Backlund, Duncan, Backlund, Valentine. I'm going to go with Lawler, and I don't really want to include Dundee in this. I'm going to put Lawler on the side, but Lawler versus Latham and Ferris. I think in a vacuum alone, that was the best feud in professional wrestling in 1979.
Okay. I also do not have Bob Backlund, any of Bob Backlund's as number one. But that's interesting because it was an interesting feud. It wasn't in a top territory, but I've certainly seen the 1979 Memphis footage that's out there, and I don't want anyone thinking that I don't like it or didn't respect it. It was great stuff.
Since when is Memphis not a top territory?
Since the beginning of time.
Memphis always drew big crowds. They drew as much as anybody outside of like the top tier.
That there's some truth to that. I think there's also some myth to that. I have seen a lot of footage from the Mid-South Coliseum where there are a lot of empty seats, and this is long before the war started in 1984.
Oh yeah, no, I mean I'm not saying. Go ahead, Thomas.
Once you get past the WWF and to an extension Crockett in Georgia, I would put, in the late 70s, before the war, early 80s, I would put Memphis on par with Dallas or with Florida or with Mid-South. Yeah. And then when cable came around, then off to the races. But I would put them as a 3A just behind the AWA in the late 70s.
Here's the way I see it. The guys go to Memphis. Portland and Memphis stand out to me, and I'm not saying anything bad about the territories. I enjoyed those two territories, but you went there to become a star somewhere else. Like, you didn't see Jimmy Snuka going from Mid-Atlantic to Portland. He went from Portland to Mid-Atlantic. You didn't see guys, leave Florida or Mid-South or the WWF for Memphis. You saw them leave Memphis for those territories to get pushes. And that's why I have those two territories ranked slightly below the other ones that, frankly got more coverage in the magazines.
There's one other reason why guys didn't go there to become a star, and Jimmy Valiant did, but guys didn't go there to become a star is because you had so many homesteaders there that you weren't getting past Jerry Lawler.
No, you weren't. And Jerry Lawler would have been a star anywhere in the world.
Yep. So, I mean, why would you go there?
Establishing when he back to Memphis. Terry Funk's a great example of that. Terry Funk was a star and went to Memphis after the fact. Of course, that's an outlier, of course, obviously, but Memphis is we don't besmirch ECW for building stars for WCW, WWF. We accepted it for what it was, and you play the cards you're dealt in that matter. And I think without a shadow of a doubt, Memphis was at worst from 75 to 85. At worst, the fourth best promotion. At worst, it was the third between 3 and 4. I would say they were nowhere. I think they were better than Florida. I think they were better than Mid-South up until like 1983. I think they were better than Dallas up until 82. So
Dallas is a good
7-year portion. You're looking at a 7-year ticket where Memphis was, I don't want to call it the top indie promotion in wrestling, but if you're looking at it from a 2019 perspective, it was the best indie promotion in wrestling.
No, that's a good point. And by the way, I do have in 1979. Definitely, we have Dallas in that same kind of bowl as Portland and Memphis. I like your analogy when you ECW to during the Monday Night Wars. Like, Taz leaves ECW after being their top star for God knows how long, after being fed the promotion to get him over. And when he went to the WWF, he was a middle of the card guy. He was just another guy there. Same thing with Sandman in WCW. He was a huge star in ECW, not so much in WCW. And that's how it went for a lot of the Memphis guys. I don't know. But anyway, Thomas, I'm sorry. The bullets are flying as usual. Did we get your top 5 list?
For a Feud of the Year, Feud of the Year, I'd have to put in there. Obviously, the number 1 would be Lawler versus Latham and Ferris. 2 would be really Backlund versus Albano, and whatever guys Albano put in front of him. I'd put that as number 2. 3, I would go Paul Jones and Ricky Steamboat, because that was wailing into 79, and from there, I think really 4 through 7, it's really subjective. I could go several different ways on that, and I really kind of feel like I'm being anti-political here because I've gone through 3 awards now. I've mentioned the AWA or Florida one time, and I kind of feel like I'm shortchanging them at this point.
You're not. I mean, just because those were excellent promotions, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to place in the top 5 for all this. I mean, let's face it, I like the AWA, but they weren't exactly like, doing top feuds or great angles, anything like that.
Well, one angle, what about Mad Dog and Vern? That certainly popped the area.
You mean just the angle of like those two old-time enemies, and they've been enemies for decades, teaming up?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's why one big reason why they got on my list as Tag Team of the Year.
So, I would put that would be one of them, is that the feud that brought them together. It's Kern and Lane against St. John, and Kern and Graham against St. John and Lane. My one would be the same as Thomas's. That was by far. This is not like a huge feud year. There's no Zbyszko Bruno here, but that was the one feud that just popped. It was, you could tell that Jerry. I was reading something leading up to this. Lance said it once before, and then Dundee on one of those little podcasts where he had hair across his ass against Lawler for some reason, and he goes, "You nearly killed your Uncle Wayne, your cousin Wayne, with the mustard jar." And it was when they were in the brawl, he hucked the mustard jar and he missed him by about 8 inches, and the thing exploded against the wall behind him. There was just something. There was like a chemistry, and I'm throwing Dundee in there too because he was adding to it. That whole feud between those 4 was just fantastic all year long.
Okay, so that's your number 1. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. What's your 2 through 5?
I would say again the one with who was it, Akbar, that ended up bringing Mad Dog and Vern together again.
Akbar.
Who brought them together? I can't remember the feud that brought them together again. In the AWA in '79.
Oh, Patterson and Stevens were the tag team champions. I think they were managed by. No, they weren't managed by Heenan. Heenan was in Georgia. I actually don't know the angle that brought them together. If someone, an AWA fan, and we have them from '79, could put that on our Facebook group, that would be really cool. Okay, well, I like you guys' picks. Here are mine. Number 1, I thought there was one really good feud that in 1979 that I'm not going to say is comparable to Bruno Zbyszko, but I thought the best feud of 1979, the feud of the year, if you will, was Dusty Rhodes against Terry Funk. The falling out from Terry Funk breaking Dusty Rhodes' arm before his next match against Harley Race and losing the belt back. They had a really good feud. Funk also had a really good feud with Manny Fernandez thrown in the mix with Dusty Rhodes. Funk just made an amazing comeback. He was an amazing heel. There was a movie out in 1979. It was called 10. It featured a brand new movie star named Bo Derek who had braids in her hair, and that became kind of a thing with the girls. And Terry Funk went out and got braids in his hair. It was wonderful. My number 2 was Bob Backlund versus Pat Patterson, which I thought was a very memorable feud, not only just because it had that magic number 4 next to it, but because they went around the horn and the whole thing was really good, and it was an excellent story that Pat Patterson stole the Intercontinental title from Ted DiBiase, and his intent was to steal the WWF title from Backlund in the exact same manner. My number 3, another really good one, I thought, Paul Jones versus Ricky Steamboat. The teacher turns on the student and becomes the most hated wrestler in the game. Also, Paul Jones versus Ric Flair got consideration from me, or I guess it would have been Paul Jones and Baron von Raschke against Ric Flair, but it didn't make my top 5. Number 4 was Dusty Rhodes and various partners against Ole Anderson and Ivan Koloff. We talked about the angle that, set that one off. And number 5, just in general, it's Gino Hernandez and whoever he was teaming with, whether it be El Gran Marcus or Pac Song or Mark Lewin, against Kerry and Kevin Von Erich. Thomas, can you share your thoughts?
I feel like you've hit the nail on the head there. I can't believe I omitted Dusty Terry Funk, actually. I feel like that probably should have been in my top 3, but I can't dispute either of you guys with your top five. I don't see a single thing wrong with them in any aspect.
My only souring about the Funk feud is the fact that why it was done with the broken arm and the NWA title thing, which is annoying. But yeah, as far as execution, Terry was his usual brilliant self.
And we'll talk more about this when we do part 2 of this episode next week. Terry Funk in the United States had kind of been forgotten. He did not have any major pushes, any major anything since he lost the NWA title to Harley Race on, I think it was February 7th, 1977. I mean, he was, he legitimately needed knee surgery, and he worked Japan, but he did not do basically anything except for, I think, a little St. Louis until like 2.5 years later when he returns to Florida. But
was there a movie in here he was in?
Yes. It was a movie with Sylvester Stallone, and I'm trying to think of the name. It was really bad. Don't watch it, people. It was an awful movie. It was like about club fighting or something like that in Philadelphia, and it just sucked. I guarantee you Lou's going to have this. Lou's going to know this by the time we're done. But, I actually went to see it at the theater for no other reason than Terry Funk was in a movie, and he's a pro wrestler. And even as a kid.
Alley.
What's that?
Paradise Alley.
Thank you. Paradise Alley. How could I forget? And and then I saw it on cable. And even as a kid, I'm like, man, this stinks. And I saw it maybe 10 years ago, and it was just as awful as it had ever been. But that's what you get when Sylvester Stallone can just do whatever he wants and doesn't have to make good movies anymore. But anyway, I think we have time for one more category. The PWI, or the Apter Magazine, most popular wrestler of the year. And please let me give you theirs. Number 1 is Dusty Rhodes. Number 2 is Andre the Giant. First time we've heard his name. Number 3 is Ivan Putski. And number 4 is Mr. Wrestling 2. Thomas Bane, you're the guest. Can I get your reaction to their top 4?
I mean, they pretty much hit the nail on the head in terms of the big-time promotions. My number 1 is Dusty Rhodes. I think he would have been the most over babyface no matter what company he would have been in, from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon. Andre is a comparable number 2 in the fact that he was, over and popular everywhere. But I don't know if he would have, in 79, maintained the same popularity had he stayed in one place for 6 months to a year like Dusty did.
No, there's absolutely no way.
Putski was insanely over. I would put Lawler at 3, however, and then at 4, I would go actually with David Von Erich.
That's an interesting one, because David was on the rise both in Dallas and St. Louis.
Yeah, I had go ahead, Thomas.
I was like, if you recall, on the WWE Network, there's a match, I believe, in St. Louis from, I believe, the fall of 78, where he wrestles Harley Race, and Harley kind of just, on the house mic, gives him the decree of this guy's going to be a world champion someday, and kind of gives him his blessing, even though Harley was a heel and David was a over babyface.
And you got to remember, David was 18 or 19 years old at that point. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
And at 5, just going by everything, I guess you begrudgingly got to say Backlund because he's the world champion, or 4 at Bob Backlund. I go Backlund 4, and at 5, I think 5 is Ric Flair, actually, at that point in time in 79.
Well, I've got him at number 3, so it's not that crazy, Thomas.
I, again, would have Dusty. I think that's an easy one. This was a big Dusty year. If you remember the response he got when he won the title, that was not faked. That place went nuts. So, he and Andre at 2. Yeah, fine. He's not in the main event. I can't do it. I wrestling 2. You know what? I didn't see it, but he's main event in the Superdome. So, I mean, he must be doing something right.
And the Omni.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and the Omni.
I was going to say, and the Omni too. So, I mean, I have no problem. Him there. David Von Erich's another good one, and so is So was Jerry Lawler. Another one with consideration is Tommy Rich. This was his really first big popular year on the big stage in Georgia.
All right, I can see that. Let me say something about PWI's top four. Dusty Rhodes. Dusty Rhodes is my number one. Dusty was at his peak. His peak was ending right around now. That 76 through 79. Like right now, he's probably just about to start falling backward in Florida. But he got my number one, so I agree with Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Andre the Giant, when it comes to stuff like this, when it comes to ranking him every year, Wrestler of the Year, most popular, whatever, he is really, really tough to rank. I mean, it's because he didn't stay in one place. He didn't win titles. He was usually in a novelty match. Very rarely was he in a feud. The only real feud I'm aware of that Andre was in at this time, like throughout his entire career, was when he kind of had a feud with Ernie Ladd in New York. Then again, he kind of went around the horn with Ernie Ladd. So we'll say Ernie Ladd, but that's it. They didn't start using him, in my opinion, correctly until the WWF started regularly bringing in big men for him to go up against, starting with Hulk Hogan in 1980. Then they had the weird thing with Killer Khan in 81, Blackjack Mulligan in 82, and then Big John Studd in 83. To me, that's how you use Andre the Giant. And I know I've said this before. To this day, I don't understand how they didn't have a big Andre the Giant versus Bruiser Brody program in 76 or 77. But anyway, Ivan Putski at number 3, I totally don't get that one. Yes, he was over in the Northeast, no question. Very popular wrestler, but I just don't see him in the top 10. He wasn't even the number one guy in his own promotion. The most popular guy in the WWF was Bob Backlund. You can even argue Dusty Rhodes in the WWF because he was around 1979. Mr. Wrestling 2, I agree with. He didn't make my top 5, but I can't argue with him, number 4. With that, here is my top 5. And it was hard for me not to get Jerry Lawler and Mr. Wrestling 2 in there. But number 1, Dusty Rhodes. Like I said, he peaked. My number 2 is Tommy Rich, the brand new spanking hot star, red hot in Georgia. It came to the point where you put Tommy Rich on the road away from Georgia, he was drawing on the road because of WTBS. Number 3, Ric Flair. The turn that, we talked earlier, it was inevitable, even though I didn't know it. And when he turned, he became an incredibly popular wrestler in the Carolinas. Similar vein to Ric Flair, I have Blackjack Mulligan as number 4, 1979. He was a huge star who had just turned in the Carolinas. And number 5, look, the Northeast loved Bob Backlund. That's all there was to it. If you go back and watch a 1979 match from the Spectrum or Madison Square Garden involving Bob Backlund, and those are your only 2 choices, I mean, he gets such a huge reaction from that crowd. They eat the guy up. He could be higher. Again, Lawler and 2, it was hard not putting them in, but I've only got 5 spots for 7 guys, so there you go.
Well, I mean, it's I really, you may be right about 2. I'm just going on the fact that he's main eventing in these 2 buildings. One other thing about Rich, though, and we talked about this in another show, at one point during the year, and I don't know the reasoning, but when they sent the AWA guys down to Georgia, one of the things they did was they put the Crusher with Tommy. And I think the idea was to give Tommy the rub from the Crusher. It ended up working the reverse. Mm-hmm. Is that the Crusher ended up getting credit in Georgia by hanging around Tommy. Tommy was, at this point, he was the it guy. You could feel it off him, and he would keep that position for another about 2-3 years.
Yeah, I mean, and it was in Georgia at this point, they had a clear pecking order of who was the top baby faces. Mr. Wrestling 2 was the top baby face. But Tommy Rich, he was like that number 2 who was coming on. And when you look back, and maybe this is revisionist history, but it almost seemed like the Tommy Rich versus Mr. Wrestling feud for who was going to be number 1 in that territory, with Mr. Wrestling 2 being the heel, and they almost did it in 1981. We talked about that here on the show. I mean, looking back, it seemed inevitable.
Oh, that was a painful attempt in 81 too.
Oh,
God. I mean, basically the idea was that they were going to have them feud over the fact that Tommy won the most popular wrestler of the year, and 2 came off as the whiniest person, and it was terrible. They aborted it within about 2-3 weeks.
Yeah, they did, and I remember that. And they made it obvious that 2 was turning, and then for whatever reason they backed off of it. I mean, 2 was insufferable in 1984 when they did a very similar angle in Mid-South when he became Magnum TA's mentor, and then he became jealous of Magnum TA and then turned on him.
I absolutely love that angle. But I will say the reason why I didn't even consider 2 in my top 5 was when I think of the most popular wrestler, I think of when someone is going to buy a wrestling ticket, they're going to go, I'm there to see Dusty Rhodes, or I'm there to see Andre the Giant, Tommy Rich, David Von Erich, Jerry Lawler. They just mention that name. No one says, I'm going to see Mr. Wrestling 2. I'm going to see Wrestling 2 versus Ernie Ladd.
They did in Georgia.
Mr. Wrestling 2's popularity came from, I think, the angle and the opponent that he had, not so much the popularity that he had.
I mean, it could be said the vice versa as well, but every time he was in Mid-South of Georgia, he sold. So, I mean, again, you may be completely right. I'm not a huge 2 fan at this point, and I'm just going off the fact that in the biggest arenas around and in various promotions, he's at the top of the card.
Yeah, I get what Thomas is saying, though, and in a way he's right. I have always put forward the theory that, yes, Bob Backlund was the drew as WWF champion, but people didn't throw down their money, I want to see Bob Backlund. I think they threw down their money, I want to see WWF wrestling, I want to see the WWF title defended. Like,
How many wrestlers got
all over the place to see Andre the Giant in Ames, Iowa, or something like that? And so yeah, I get that. But I mean, there's 2 sides of it. Go ahead, Sean.
How many wrestlers got invited to a presidential inaugural?
No, good point. But that's because he was Jimmy Carter's mom's favorite wrestler. That was the only reason.
And Jimmy Carter, Miss Lillian Jimmy Carter's mom was a woman of the people.
There you go. And with that, next week, we are going to continue. The next thing we're going to talk about next week is the PWI Most Hated Wrestler of the Year Award. I'm looking forward to that. Once again, this is always the fastest 60 minutes of my week. Thomas, thanks for coming on. Looking forward to having you back next week.
Thank you guys for having me. Look forward to being on next week as well.
All right. And by the way, it's not a pre-recorded show. We're actually going to come back 6 days from now, December the 10th, and we're going to do part 2. I want to thank Sean Goodwin for everything he does for this show, my convivial co-host. He does a lot of things that you guys just don't see. Another guy who does things that you guys just don't see is Lou Kipilman. We give him a very raw product after 60 minutes of chatter, and he puts it all together and makes it sound good. So thank you, Lou. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in and listening to Stick to Wrestling every week. My name's John McAdam. Thank you again. We'll see you next week. Go Vols. Let's get a good bowl game.
Stick to Wrestling is a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network.